It's day 18 of the war in Ukraine, and there has been no let-up in the fighting. Russian forces have continued their operations all over the country. There was more heavy shelling of Chernihiv, and the American journalist was shot dead near Irpin. That attack on the Yavoriv base near the Polish border is the furthest west the Russians have attacked since the invasion started. Ukrainians have also been protesting against the Russian occupation in Kherson, but there has been hopeful messages from both sides over the negotiations, although it is too early to tell whether that will lead to anything substantive. The Russian missiles hit just before dawn. The enormous blast could be felt 30 miles away in Lviv. This is what a Russian world looks like, says the Ukrainian filming. A crater you can fit an entire truck inside. The huge military base at Yavoriv has hosted many NATO visitors. It's suspected by Russia of being a hub for the Western military aid being brought into Ukraine. It was then a military target, but at the hospital, so close to the Polish border, they are painfully aware of the obvious risk now. We are just a few miles away from NATO being dragged into war.
Починають падати вже за 10 кілометрів до кордону з Європою. І завтра вони можуть падати вже за 10 кілометрів від кордону на польській території, де знаходяться наші дружини, де знаходяться наші діти.
To the north, the Russian onslaught is laying waste to Chernihiv. The fire brigade is still extraordinarily managing to find people alive and get them out. But the only thing left here is defiance.
Хочеться, щоб ми були і показали, що ми українці, ми нація, ми згуртовані, ми друг за друга стоїмо. Дай Бог, щоб швидше війна закінчилася, щоб люди настроїлись.
In Kherson, the first major city taken by the Russians, thousands of unarmed Ukrainians marched in fury at the occupation, shouting insults until Russian forces fired into the air. The protesters carried on anyway. The Russians also released aerial footage of their bombing campaign, claiming Ukrainian extremists are stopping civilians from using the humanitarian corridors to escape. It's a familiar Russian line used before in Syria. But the Russians also claim there's been significant progress at the peace talks. One delegate claimed a deal could be just days away. In the capital, President Zelensky visited soldiers in hospital to award honours. Though perhaps this is the honour any soldier wants now, more than a medal. The President's Chief of Staff said Ukraine will give up nothing at the talks and that the Russians are listening, not giving ultimatums. If Russia hopes maximum pain equals maximum pressure, it is on full show in towns now pounded for over 2 weeks. The emergency teams say this was a school in Mykolaiv. And this was a hospital.
Я здесь живу с 50-го года. Я 42 года работала врачом.
For Dr. Galina Verona and others who missed the last evacuation buses from Volnovakha, home is now a bunker, not even standing room only. Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, joins me now from the capital, Kiev. Lindsay, there have been more casualties where you are. What is the latest in Kiev?
Christian, we don't know how many people were killed in the Kiev area today. What we do know is that there was certainly a serious artillery barrage. We heard it ourselves on the outskirts of Irpin, which is this town to the northwest. An American journalist, as you mentioned, called Brent Renault, a filmmaker. He was in a car, an unmarked car, with a colleague, and that car came under fire from what is believed to have been a Russian checkpoint. He was killed on the spot. His colleague is in hospital being treated now. The mayor of Irpin has said that journalists won't be allowed to go there anymore because it's too dangerous. But what about for the ordinary Ukrainian people there? Many of them are still stuck there. They're trying to get out, but it's almost impossible for them to move now because it's so dangerous. You also mentioned Mykolaiv. That's the southern port where we were last week. 9 people died in what the governor said was an air attack today. So as you can see, this war is becoming increasingly dangerous for civilians.
And if you look at the bigger picture of this war after 18 days, Lindsay, where do you think it is?
Well, if we say that Putin's plan A was the thunder run down to Kyiv to take this capital and install a puppet government, that didn't work. So what's he doing instead? What we're seeing is attacks all over the country, in the west where you are, here around Kyiv where I am, in the south and in the east as well. So he's not trying to take territory, it seems, but to cause chaos, to make it impossible to govern this country. And that attack on the west, that is just 15 miles from the border with Poland, a NATO country. Supposing something goes astray into NATO, well, I think that what Putin is trying to do is escalate, to say this isn't a special operation in Ukraine anymore, which is what he's told the Russian people, but a fight between Russia and NATO. There's going to be a lot of worry in Brussels and in Washington about that tonight.
Thanks, Lindsay. Well, I'm joined now by Fabrice Potier, who is a former NATO Director of Policy and is a member of President Macron's En Marche party. Fabrice Potier, the war is now less than 10 miles from the border of NATO. How is NATO supposed to respond?
Well, I think first, NATO is obviously very concerned by the big message that it received from Vladimir Putin, which is stay out of this war. And if not, I'm going to increase the pressure on the indirect role you are playing, which is essentially supplying arms. I think the answer should be very clear to that. We should not fall into Putin's blackmail. He's blackmailing us on nuclear, he's blackmailing us on chemical weapons, and now he's blackmailing us on hitting basically ever closer to the NATO border. And to that, I think we should have the courage to regain some control over the escalation. The problem right now is Putin is the only one who has that control, and he's escalating at will.
Right, but when he says something, he tends to do it right now. So when the threat is over the supply lines from foreign countries, they are also claiming apparently that there may be foreign fighters who are casualties in this latest attack on the West. Does that make you rethink the foreign supply lines? There's also been a train attack today elsewhere in the country.
Yes. No, it makes me rethink, I think, the relative passivity of NATO on trying to basically put more pressure on the Putin war machine. He's setting red lines, but it's also up to us to redefine this red line. And he's successful in doing so, you're right, because we are not willing to make him face the cost of us pushing back on his red line. So I think this is really the call now is on NATO as to whether it will have the leadership and the courage to acknowledge that this war is not just technically outside the NATO border, it's actually burning at our doorstep. And when your doorstep is burning, you can't just close your door and ignore it. And this is essentially what is now really us to respond. And I think we have to be more willing to put more military pressure on Vladimir Putin.
But what is the cost that you're talking about? I mean, the economic war has been ramped up almost as far as it can go. Are you talking about a military cost involving NATO?
Absolutely. I think we have to be honest about that. This is not a war that you can, again, isolate yourself from. Every day, actually, Putin is redefining the red lines, and every day those red lines are getting closer to our border. So I think kind of watching and sitting is not going to help. And yes, I think we have to be willing to look at the risk and the possible cost of getting more actively involved militarily. Now we actually face the risk of not being involved on our terms, and Putin just keep on defining those red lines. So I do think we have to do that. To give you an example, I do think we should deliver to the Ukrainian forces air defense system, so at least they can make sure that Western Ukraine is free from this sort of attack we have seen earlier this morning.
You're a former head of NATO policy. I'm sure you're in touch with many people still there. Are there people in NATO thinking the way you are?
I can't speak for them, and I will not want to speak in their place. But I can tell you that I think there's a very robust debate going on within NATO about whether we should just focus on the NATO allies' security and defense, or whether NATO should play indeed a more extensive role. But the buck stops with Washington and few other big capitals in Europe who are actually not really willing, as they're actually saying themselves, their leaders, including President Biden, that NATO should not and will not play a role in this conflict. I think it's a profound mistake. We have a moral and a strategic responsibility to push back on what Vladimir Putin is doing.
Fabrice Potier, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Russian investigative journalist and broadcaster Yevgenia Albats, whose websites and television broadcasts have now been blocked by the Russian authorities. We have seen images today of many brave Russians daring to protest against the war and being bundled away, arrested by Russian security forces very promptly. What do you think is going on in terms of Russian public opinion now?
I think that Russian public opinion slowly but surely is getting it. It's getting that Russian government and Russian troops are waging a war of choice and conquest in Ukraine right now.
Are people in Russia seeing the same images the rest of the world is? Are they getting those messages through about how this is going militarily?
There are no longer any independent TV networks exist in the country. All those that existed, they got closed, so there was only propaganda machine. They say that Ukrainian nationals or Ukrainian nationalist battalions were destroying infrastructure of the Ukrainian cities. That's what they are shown on the Russian propaganda channels. So for those of us who would like to know the reality, we have to use VPN, virtual private network, and go and get footage from the Telegram channels.
Well, today, as you say, we have seen an escalation in the bombing to the west of Ukraine, very, very close to the border with Poland, a NATO country, just a few miles away, where they have hit that military base. What do you think is President Putin's strategy now?
Listen, I'm unable to figure out what's going on in the head of a sick man. I don't know. However, it terrifies me to think that the government of the Russian Federation decided to occupy the entire country. Part of my family came from the western Ukraine. My father fought in Nikolaev during the World War II in the autumn of 1941 when Ukraine was occupied by Nazis. So I walked myself around Nikolaev, and now I see Nikolaev is on fire. So to be honest with you, I'm just terrified by what is happening, not because of my own life, who cares, but because of what happened to Ukrainians and to the fact that my fellow citizens, I am a taxpayer, I am a citizen of the Russian Federation. That's the only passport I have. That my own troops are doing this in Ukraine, and I cannot stand this.
There is a diplomatic meeting between the United States and China coming up in the next couple of days. Do you think China could place pressure on President Putin to cease fire?
Yes, I do think that China has this ability because basically Russian Federation and Russian economy is totally destroyed by the sanctions imposed. In a matter of 3-4 weeks, people in the major cities would notice a shortage of goods and foods they got accustomed to. In a matter of a couple of months, the entire country will recall what was it like to live under Soviets when everything was when there was shortage of everything. So I think that yes, China has a say over Russia right now. Whether Chinese leadership is capable to convince Putin to back up, I'm not so sure about that. It's going to be hard. But I think that China is the major winner of the current situation.
Yevgeny Albats, thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Stay safe.